So in the last lecture and the lecture before that, we were looking at the styles of neoclassicism and romanticism, which were coming out of the ideas of the Enlightenment. And these styles are also viewed as responses to the political events of the time, things like colonialism and imperialism and the quest for democracy. Now, in this lecture, we're going to look at artwork that represents further a shift in ideas, and that style is realism. Now, this is a shorter lecture, and it really is intended just to give you an overarching sense of the style, because this lecture does have a companion lecture on the early history of photography. Now, the people of Europe, they were living in an age of emerging modernity during this time, and they were looking for ways to escape this sense of constant change, a change that was being brought about by the Industrial Revolution. Now, I cannot emphasize enough how impactful the Industrial Revolution was on the history of humanity. Dare I say even it was the most important event ever? And I say this, I ask that question rhetorically, but no, because the impact was so widespread. It seems as though there was not one aspect of life that the emergence of the Industrial Revolution did not affect. Social, political, economic, cultural, familial, demographically, environmentally. I could keep going, but I think you get the point. So what it is it's a lot of sweeping changes, and they're coming quickly, one after the other. And if there's one thing that we can say about human beings, it's that people don't like change. People like things to be the same, to be consistent, because it makes us feel safe and comfortable. Too much change is overwhelming. It robs us of the sense of stability that the familiar provides, and that is what realism sought to address. Think about it. If change is happening quickly, it's hard to feel as though you have your feet firmly underneath you. To remedy this is to stick with what you know. And what is it that we can truly know? Philosophical debates aside, what is it that we could truly know? Two things: truth and this present moment. The past is in the past, and the future is unseen. And this is what realism sought to address: the present moment, the here and now. It's this idea that if you just stay in this moment, in this one day, there's not going to be significant changes happening. And we can take comfort in this. It's when you widen your scope and you look at change cumulatively that it starts to become too much. And this is actually quite an effective approach when you think about it. So, the primary subject then, the aim of the realist movement, is to objectively capture everyday life while rejecting the subjectivity and emotionalism of romanticism. We talked about addressing the present moment just a few minutes ago, but what about this concept of truth that I had mentioned? The realists, their search for objective truth didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was reinforced by positivism, which was a philosophical movement that championed the scientific method. It encouraged observation and its dispassionate consideration of nature and society. Now, this includes analysis and careful recordings of data, and these are approaches that should be used to govern the environment and people's interactions with one another. Now, to just drive this point home to you, if you're analyzing and carefully recording data, what are you not doing? You're not feeling any feelings, right? So a counterpoint to romanticism. Now, since we're on the topic of romanticism in the context of realism, this is a good painting for us to start out with because it's a transitional work, which we've seen this a couple times in this class so far, these artworks that demonstrate to us the ways in which stylistic shifts could be gradual, and that there are works of art that had features of the waning style that are combined with features of the newly emerging style. So the work we see here, this is affiliated with both realism and romanticism. So one thing we can note is that even though realism was certainly a counterpoint to romanticism, The two styles were not mutually exclusive. There could be some overlap here. So the question you might be thinking is, okay, well, what's romantic about this piece and what's realist about this piece? Now, the first part of this question you can sort of kind of answer, I think. You might not be experts per se on the romantic style, but you've been introduced to this style. You certainly, I think, can weigh in on this question. Where we're seeing this is we're seeing it in a couple ways, this romantic aspect. One of the things is the landscape. The landscape is very much in the tradition of romantic landscape painting, where it's very epic in that you've got this high horizon line that suggests these expansive fields, this large expanse of sky overhead. There's a peacefulness. There's an idealism there, which we know that that's pretty typical. And the presence of the landscape, the inclusion of these figures, I would say addresses that question of man's relationship with nature, which Romanticism certainly addressed time and time again. And I think too, if you look at this, there's this very agrarian focus, this very rural focus that you maybe could present the argument that that's nostalgic, that we don't see smokestacks and factories and all of these things indicative of the Industrial Revolution, but rather what this looks like is almost this snapshot in time, this time of a simple past. Now, what's realist about this are a couple things. First, we do see that there's a tightening up of the brushwork in some areas. There's a much more looser treatment of brushwork back here. Creates this almost hazy environment that gives us a sense of atmosphere. And we know that that is romantic. But the tightening up in here, this is going to be much more presaging of the realist style, that tight brushwork, which we're going to see examples of this as we move through this lecture. The other thing that's very realist about this piece is the subject itself. And we'll talk more about that as well. Now, this painting is called The Gleaners, and it's by the artist Jean-Francois Millet. And he was part of the Barbizon school, which was a movement within French landscape painting in the Romantic style. So you can see that romantic connection. The Barbizon school consisted of a group of artists, and they lived out in the countryside, and they painted what they were surrounded with, as I had mentioned, just a touch of nostalgia for this time before the factories began to populate the picturesque, unspoiled French landscape. Now, what we're looking at here, the figures in the foreground, we're seeing the lowest level of French society, the gleaners. The gleaners are the people who would come in and they would pick up the scraps of grain that were left after the harvest. It was backbreaking work to simply just collect leftovers, physically demanding tasks that yield minimal results at best. Yet, despite the physical demand of this labor and what I would think would be the humility that one would have to go in and pick up discarded scraps, despite this, there's something quiet and restrained and calm about these women, something dignified. There's a strength in their sturdy form, enhanced by their large size, as they occupy the foreground of the painting, commanding the majority of its compositional space. Altogether, the poor is presented as heroic and powerful. And the treatment of France's lowest class in such a way in art was quite rare, where here you have the poor represented with the same amount of respect and dignity that you would expect to see in the depiction of royalty, or rich people, or soldiers, etc., not in your everyday man, and not in like your poorest of the everyday. You've got this heroizing and idealizing treatment of the poor, but it didn't exactly sit well with the wider public. For example, there was one critic who remarked when he saw this painting, and I quote, "These are homely scarecrows set up in a field. Millet's ugliness and vulgarity have no relief." Burn. Now, I think this sort of reaction can be seen in two ways. First, it made people uncomfortable because it made very clear the level of poverty in France that existed during this time. But what it also did is it humanized the poor. These are human beings who are struggling, and you're part of this culture. You participate in this economic system. What are you going to do about it? People didn't like being asked that question. Also, this heroizing of the poor co-opted the tradition of idealism in the history of art. Here, the most noble is not some lofty concept, but it's the lowest of the low. It went against people's value systems, or I should say their value judgments. And I say good. This is art doing what art does. This is what makes art so powerful. It holds up a mirror. Sometimes we like what we see, sometimes we don't. Regardless of the view, it's important that you take a look. So we know that realism was a style aimed to provide viewers with a vision of reality, that the works focused on the experiences and sights of everyday contemporary life. What this means is that realism avoided subjects like history, fiction, tradition, myth, religion, because none of these things were part of the current visible world. This painting is by one of the most celebrated of the female realist painters. This is by Rosa Bonheur, and it's a great example of the realist approach. First, it's highly realistic. This looks like a photograph, doesn't it? But it's not, it's a painting. With realism, again, we see this very tight, crisp brushwork that functions to articulate all of the details so that the picture of reality that is presented to the viewer is as realistic and complete as possible. Another thing we want to think about is process. This is also important to the realist style, how the artworks were made, which in this case is direct observation. This work documents French rural life and the agricultural variation that existed in different regions of France. This is not as the artist is imagining it in her mind. This is as it actually was. She went out and she painstakingly observed and documented everything. The topography of the land, the clothing of the farmers, their tools, the animals, all together to provide us with a sort of visual accuracy that would appeal to even the most ardent of positivists. Now, this is the type of subject that Bonheur was best known for, highly descriptive images of animals. But going out and viewing them in person, this demanded a lot of moving around, a lot of physical activity. And so what she had to do is she had to go and she had to apply with the police department for a permit. And this permit only was valid for 6 months. It expired after 6 months. A permit from the police department to wear pants in public because it was considered to be a public health risk for women to wear pants in public. So all of you women out there who are sitting in your pants or your shorts, send up a word of thanks to people like Rosa Bonheur for making it possible for us to wear pants in public. Here we have a piece by the artist Gustave Courbet, another well-known artist who painted in the style of realism. And he was pretty clear in his rejection of the style of romanticism because he felt that the style was a way for people to escape the realities of the time. And we can see this here. We see a depiction of common people gathered for a funeral in the countryside. If there was ever an opportunity for some romantic drama, this would be it, right? I imagine there could be people crying, like, yeah, there's people crying here, but I'm talking about crying with your arms raised up. And how about someone like ripping their shirt open in grief, right? And maybe the deceased person could be that, obligatory man with no pants that we tend to see in romantic painting. There's so many possibilities here. But instead, what we see is restrained emotion, which is typical of the realist approach. Now, like Bonheur, Courbet also works with direct observation to achieve an image that was as realistic as possible. Now, he didn't directly observe this funeral, but he did paint all of these figures from real life, assembling 50 models in his studio. What's also significant about this piece is the ways in which, similar to Millet, Courbet extols the virtues of the poor. Now, the way he did this is by making the composition large in size. That's why I included the dimensions here. 10 feet 4 inches by 21 feet 11 inches. That is a large painting. Now, usually large works reserved only for the depiction of important people or events, but here he shows the importance of the common man and the event they attend by making this image large in size, by making it authoritative. Now, you might be starting to get the sense that within realism, there were certain artists who were utilizing art to critique French labor practices and also divisions within the socioeconomic hierarchy of France. And you would be correct if you were feeling this feeling. The Industrial Revolution had been quite effective in bringing to the forefront the polarization of the social classes. Now, in 1848, there had been a rebellion in which rural laborers were asking for better working conditions and a redistribution of property. The rebellion only lasted 3 days, and it was put down rather violently. Many working class lives were lost in the process. The fact that this painting was coincidentally made just 1 year after this uprising made Courbet's work all the more uncomfortable to the French wider public. Now let's take a look at what's going on with the realist movement in American painting. We got a little bit of a glimpse with our John Singer Sargent painting, the very first one I showed in this lecture, which is a little bit of a present for you because Sargent's paintings are so amazing. We also have Thomas Eakins, and basically what you can see with Sargent and Eakins paintings is that there's not really anything too different happening in American realism that there was going on in France. Pretty much the same thing. Thomas Eakins, he's your typical realist painter. He's committed to the utmost representational exactitude, but he took it up a notch by studying not only painting, but human anatomy as well. He's like the Da Vinci of his time. Now, this work reflects the realist style particularly well in my mind, in that it reflects that interest in scientific accuracy that I addressed at the beginning of this lecture. We're coming full circle. The Gross Clinic, this painting, presents the surgeon Dr. Samuel Gross in the operating amphitheater of the Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. I just love how he's wearing his everyday street clothes, right? No gloves on, bloody hands and scalpel, lecturing, at the leg, on the leg that he's operating on, which you can see some details here, right? No big deal. And you've got this light shining down. It's a spotlight to, of course, illuminate the procedure for the students. But you could even look at this from maybe a symbolic aspect. I don't think it's a coincidence that the light is particularly reflecting off of this forehead right here. The light perhaps is a representation of wisdom and intelligence and enlightenment, all gleaned through academic study. Now, this choice of this subject is significant for a couple of reasons. First, we see that this painting is clearly a description of a contemporary event, one that celebrates intellectualism, science, education. Second, that this was even a subject at all is demonstrating to us the growing medical and scientific progress of the time. And in typical realist fashion, this is rendered very real. In fact, a little too real for many people who thought it was brutal and gross. Get it? Gross clinic? Haha. Now, this is before, Saw Part 7 3D was in theaters, and people were desensitized to gore. This was something that was really a challenging thing to look at. And you even see this lady in the back who's like freaking out. She's scared by what's going on. Now, Eakins himself, he acknowledges that, yeah, perhaps this image might be a little bit gory, but he did also say that knowledge and accurate representation were more important than whether or not we feel comfortable with what we're looking at. Well played, Mr. Eakins. And this lecture, it's heartbreakingly brief, but you will get to learn more about realism in your next lecture when you study the emergence of photography.